Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwindt.
I'm Jared Pechaček.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of By-The-Bywater. Great to have you all with us once again. It is a day where we've decided to get up early so that way there is nothing on my recording from the huge parties that are going to be happening outside my door and window here for the Super Bowl, because I do live in San Francisco, and there you go. But we have a lot of news and a lot of stuff to talk about, so instead of our usual sort of quick things, I almost want to get into it, although I do want to bring up the one thing we all were sharing and talking about on Twitter, and that is the ring that the English Police Department found, and they didn't know what it was. What was your exact reaction, Jared? You had a problem with the way they actually photographed it?
They photographed it upside down, and they were like, what are these distinctive markings? If anybody knows, can you tell? And it was like...
Was that like a bit that they were trying to do and it didn't, or were they actually clueless? Because I find it hard to believe that,
And we should explain, by the way, if you missed this bit of virality that went around, an English police department, Northwich or something like that, basically posted that someone had lost a ring. It was clearly someone's mock-up of the one ring. It had the full calligraphy, everything like that. But yes, the first photograph was upside down. And the fact that we all noticed that, well, there you go. Yeah. Needless to say, there are about 8 million comments about, just search for the hobbits in the area and all the rest of it. But... oh boy. But anyway, we could talk more about foibles, but again, such a huge amount of news that happened in January on two major fronts. So really, we just need to get right into it and then to our main topic this time around. So leading off, Jared, take it away with the news.
The biggest Tolkien-related news of the past month was, of course, the death of Christopher Tolkien at the age of 95. He'd formally stepped down from managing the estate in 2017, but that was after almost 4.5 decades of being his father's literary executor and chief researcher of his papers. He helped organize a fully formal archive in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, as well as working closely with the related archive at Marquette University. His major works included the Silmarillion, the Unfinished Tales, the 12-volume History of Middle-earth series, and his later standalone releases drawing on all this material, The Children of Húrin, Beren and Luthien, The Fall of Gondolin. His maps for Lord of the Rings are also, they remain widely influential and imitated. He also helped oversee the maintenance of the Tolkien Trust, which is the charitable arm of the estate. With his passing, only one of Tolkien's children, his daughter Priscilla, still lives, and she and younger members of the family, including Christopher's oldest son Simon, still oversee the work of the estate and the trust.
You don't want to say that Christopher was maybe just reading the writing on the wall and realized he just needed to step back, but I'm sure the reasons, as we've often speculated, the opaqueness of what goes on inside the estate and its members in terms of what they do is something we could almost try and unpack. But yeah, I mean, such a monumental figure. I mean, I'm the oldest of the three of us, and even I was too young to remember a time when Tolkien was alive. He was I was born in 71, he died in 73, so it was always Christopher. And it was always, this guy was like, oh, the son, he's presenting all this stuff. And then the books just kept appearing in this steady stream. And there was more and more material. He was the more tangible figure, I guess, for anyone in Tolkien scholarship rather than Tolkien himself. I mean, what were your impressions of him, even at a removed pace as the editor, as the thing of all this stuff? I mean, what did you guys sort of think of him, have him in your mind as?
I mean, even for me, he was almost a sort of Vala-esque figure where, like Tolkien himself was kind of Ilúvatar and, Christopher was sort of the Manwë, I guess, of the Tolkien oeuvre. I don't say that word properly. Yeah. But so he was kind of a mythical figure to me. I didn't even know he existed until the fifth go round, because I was so young when I came to the work, oh, that's why we have the Silmarillion, is this guy. It wasn't until I was 15, 16 that I was like, oh, okay, I guess he just helps out. Fine. And then it wasn't until a few years later I was like, oh no, this is we wouldn't have any of this if it weren't for him. So that's kind of I never really saw him as, this sounds horrible to say I didn't see him as a person, but he was this, this lofty figure, I guess, to me.
The impression I get is that he very much did that on purpose.
Yeah.
He was very self-effacing. It was about the work and not about him, which I think is fascinating. I would love to just have an episode about him, but we need more a biography or something that doesn't exist before we can do that.
Yeah, no, there's it'd be interesting to see if there could be one out there one of these days. Maybe there should be. Certainly, there have been a variety of appreciative articles on him in recent years. I think sort of people realizing once he stepped back from the estate, it was sort of like you could say the valedictions were already coming in. Of the various obituaries, John Garth's in The Guardian was, I thought, really excellent. Garth wrote the book Tolkien and the Great War, and he did work closely with the papers, and by default, anyone who works with the papers up until fairly recently did work essentially with Christopher Tolkien, and it's a very appreciative obituary. He says many good things about him, and it provided sort of a stronger sense of his character than I'd seen otherwise. We'll link it, of course, in the show notes. It's very much worth a read. The story I can tell, and I told this story on Facebook and elsewhere when the news came through, was the one time I got to not meet him. Kind of as Jared was saying, he very much, he held himself apart just enough, but he drew a distinction between crazy fans, let's say, the people who he specifically did want to avoid. There are reasons rather why he lived in rural France. One is he liked rural France. He said that it was more near the mountains, more near the Alps, if I remember correctly, and he said that there was more wild country there than there would ever be now in England itself, which, hey, nice if you can afford to do it, but he did it. And according to John Garth, he lived very modestly. He wasn't like in some huge mansion or anything like that, and he and his wife of many years, and collaborator on some of the other works as well. He enjoyed it for that reason, but I think he also very much did enjoy the isolation. Famously, he only did one formal interview for the entire past 20 years. Everything else was either a statement or he spoke through the books. And Garth emphasizes about how Christopher Tolkien really didn't trust computers. Sort of like he just didn't want them. Old school in a very understandable sense. So getting back to the one time I did see him, and I will treasure the moment. I mentioned this. I mentioned a couple times before. I attended the 1992 Centenary Conference in Oxford. Priscilla was the representative from the family to us, so we all had a chance to meet and chat with her, go to her house, things like this, and she enjoyed the social role, and she's a fascinating person in her own right, and it was a joy to meet with her. But Christopher showed up for a couple of days, and the photos that went around of him in the obituary on The Guardian, as well as a couple of other things that showed him standing there in a courtyard. That was Keble. I'm pretty sure that was Keble College, Oxford, where we were holding the conference. That was from 1992. I'm guessing it was from the conference because Charles Node, who I also knew from the conference and earlier things, took the photo. Long story short, there were those few people that he would meet directly with, the organizers of the conference and things like that. He at the one formal dinner he attended that we had dinners each night. The one formal dinner he attended, he was up at the high table, and that included scholars like Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull, who as a team, because they announced their engagement at that conference, and I think at that dinner, they have since done much work as sort of the next generation of really hardcore, deep textual scholars of Lord of the Rings. Came out with a Reader's Companion, came out the most recent updated edited edition, so forth. So these are the people that he could work with, he could understand, serious scholars, you could say. But the one thing I will just always remember is that at the Sheldonian in Oxford, he gave a recitation that we all got to attend precisely because we were there for the conference. It was one of the attractions. And I just, we'll have this vivid memory, just a very tall, striking-looking, elegant man, already had the full gray hair and, just sort of like, an elderly figure. And yes, his speaking voice, as was said, I believe, by many people, seemed to be far better for the stories than Tolkien's own. I seem to remember some of the readings among the Inklings. They much preferred him to do the readings of it because he had just such a strong, distinctive voice. He read from two tales. He read from The New Shadow, which was the, at that time, still unpublished fragmentary sequel to Lord of the Rings that Tolkien had started very briefly and almost like a spy thriller, but then after a few pages it ended. So he read the whole of that to us, and it wasn't published until a couple of years later. Needless to say, we were all like, oh man, because that was the first anyone had ever actually read the whole or heard the whole thing. But then he also read from the updated version of Oriana's favorite person, Tuor, and the Coming to Gondolin. And this was from the bit where Tuor comes out, having picked up from Mount Terrace the shield and everything like that, and having spoken with Olmo, so it's the following day, and it was part of that sequence. It was the whole Olmo sequence, and then he sees Veronwë down on the beach, just sort of like looking where he's been, washed up on the shore. And I will forever remember just the way he was caught in the theater's light at the podium, and just the way he said it, "Hail Veronwë, I await you." And there's no way I can imitate that, but just,
God.
he had a good sense of drama, and that was one of those just spine chills up your spine moments. When Tolkien works, it works. When it's read by somebody like that who knew the work so well and delivered it just so, I count myself lucky. That was a lovely moment. So best to his memory, and thanks to him for everything he did. It really was a pleasure to have seen that. But let's shift over to other news. So, Oriana, you want to tell us about the TV series that's finally getting somewhere?
Yeah, we've sort of got some actual tangible news where the Television Critics Association winter press tour was in January. It's, for those who don't know, it's like a 3-week-long dog and pony show that the networks put on, and Amazon was there, and on their day they finally confirmed a lot of the casting news that we had been getting and added a whole bunch of stuff. So, but we still don't actually know who these people are playing. So, sort of a very mixed bag. The concrete information we have is that, okay, so I'm just going to list a bunch of names here, and y'all can IMDb them. Ned has, thankfully IMDb'd them and done some research that we will talk about in a sec. So these people have been formally confirmed as appearing on the series. We have, and apologies to if any of these people are listening to this. Thanks for listening, and so I'm so sorry. Robert Aramayo, Morpeth Clark, Emma Horvath, Markella Kavanaugh, Joseph Mall, and we also have like a huge bunch of actors from the UK and Australia and Puerto Rico and Canada, including Owen Arthur, Nazanin Boniadi, Tom Budge. Thank you, Tom Budge, for having a very English name. Ismail Cruz Cordova, Tyro Muhafidin, Sophia Nomvete, Megan Richards, Dylan Smith, Charlie Vickers, and Daniel Wayman. And production is officially set to start this month, right? February?
Filming is supposed to kick right in sometime here in February, yeah.
We'll see how that goes. But so what are our feelings on these casting?
If they're so foolish as to put Ismail Cruz Cordova in like a prosthetic or makeup, they are completely missing out. I mean, make him the lead.
Right?
I mean, yeah. Striking looking actor.
This was the one with the cheekbones.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was one with the cheekbones.
The cheekbone.
Cheekbones in the eyes. and it should very much be noted that it is after that original batch of names who, frankly, I'm sure all great. I'm sure all been cast for a reason. It was all looking very white and pale, to be utterly honest. But this overall new batch announcement that we have everything, a number, not just one, thankfully, a number of actors of color. That does include Cordova. It also includes we have Nazanin Boniadi is Iranian, or Persian, I should say, in background. Also Persian in background, but her background is she speaks Farsi, but I don't know which parent from which country, but is Sophia Nomvete, who is also African in background, but I believe born and raised in England. Don't quote me. There's Tyro Muhafidin, who is part Indonesian. And Megan Richards is background is partially I believe Chinese. I could be wrong. East Asian descent, and so on. And I bring all this up not in the sense of let's like stereotype them, more in the sense of look, it's nice to have a vision of Tolkien here that is more inclusive somehow. that is at least somewhat better than before. But Oriana, do you want to throw in more on this? I mean, I knew you've had thoughts on this in the
Well,
past.
this is one thing where it's like, I'm so happy that people of color are getting these roles, and I'm so happy that they're getting money and like this, that's the good here. But the one thing I want to caution is that I see this a lot where, again, I'm bring all of the actors of color in that we can. It's wonderful. But I do want to caution that this is, unless they have made crazy changes to the source material, this is plastic representation, and that doesn't make it wrong or bad, but it's a little similar to when people go, oh, well, it's time for a black James Bond, it's time for a black Batman, etc. These stories are all rooted in whiteness, and Batman and Bond, yes, but Tolkien in particular, it's a white story. And it doesn't mean that people of color can't be involved in telling it, but I do want it, like, the solution to the problem of representation that is plastic in nature, that is solely representative visually. The solution is to also adapt like Earthsea. You know what I mean? Is to have other stories that are not deeply, deeply rooted in whiteness, in Northern Europeanness, because I don't see how it's still a white story. It is anti-colonial in theme, but it is a colonial perspective. So there's a lot of layers here that I think, again, it's and all the people look great, because that's all we really have to go off of at this point. But I do. It is one of those things where, like, I was thinking about the difference between, the Wheel of Time and Tolkien's work, where Tolkien's work in particular it was specifically written to reflect a Northern European sort of mythology and to be bound with the English language as spoken by white English people in particular. Whereas the Wheel of Time is, it's not bound to the English language spoken by white people. It's not bound to a Northern European viewpoint. And so I think that's why it's a little easier to introduce non-white perspectives and sensibilities in that kind of work. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Jared, you want to throw in there?
I agree.
Oh, good. Yay!
Well done.
Because like you were saying, he was very much, like, whether consciously or not, kind of working out of the nationalist movements that were happening in Europe all through that time. And he was like, well, England doesn't, everybody else has their mythology. I want England to have its mythology. So it's like very much created around whiteness, and just casting like a black elf isn't necessarily going to fix anything. Right. And it also does concern me a little bit that because we don't know who they're playing, and maybe this is a needless worry, we don't know who they're playing, there's a lot of people of color in the books, but they're all villainous.
Yes.
And I'm worried about that.
Right.
Here.
That actually led me to a question I realized we hadn't talked about in our various discussions of these actors, which, again, we've been doing privately. I sort of dug up stuff about them. A lot of people just very fascinating. And frankly, I think Sofia Novete's resume and sort of her stage range is really, really interesting. I'm kind of very much interested to see what she does. This question occurred to me. So, okay, Morfydd Clark is apparently young Galadriel. And again, apparently, but that wasn't formally announced. That was just in the one story. We don't know who it's playing. But looking at all this and thinking of the story and thinking of how this works out, which one of these characters is Sauron? Who's Anatar?
Oh, no.
One of these actors is surely that. Now, they said they haven't completed casting yet. Maybe they're not going to do that. But if they're going to do Anatar, someone's got to be. They can't just simply have be a voice like in the Jackson films or in just a figure. Yeah. There's got to be. So is one of these Anatar?
Ooh. I mean, I'm still holding out for Alexander Skarsgård as Anatar, personally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It could be fun. The one other thing there are a couple things one can note. We have some of these actors are noted singers. We are, as far as we know, not getting a jaskier about tossing rings into the fire and things like this with bards.
I will walk.
Yeah, goodbye.
I'm sorry, I will walk.
But we may have some singers. We may have something. There may be some song. Who knows? Who knows?
I would love someone singing the Lay of Lathan or whatever.
Yeah,
I would love that. I just don't want a freaking bard.
No,
I'm sorry.
No, that would be weird.
Yeah, Tolkien doesn't really have those, and maybe we should be lucky there.
Everyone is a bard.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone's their own bard. You're absolutely right, really. Tyro Muhafidin is a young actor. I believe he's maybe only 13, 14, so also sort of interesting on that front. Exactly
who
what
is
there.
that?
Yeah.
Maybe that's Anatar.
Oh my God,
Yeah.
baby Anatar.
What better way to appeal to a kid actor too? You get to play the source of all evil in the universe. You're the only bad guy. Yeah.
That would actually be a kind of interesting way, and it would actually be a way for Celebrimbor and the others to not look like morons.
Yeah.
If it is,
Valar sent us this child, everything's fine.
That's nicely counterintuitive. Maybe it turns out that way.
that
Who
would
knows?
be interesting. I could support
Right.
that.
I mean, yeah, I don't see Amazon as being a very counterintuitive sort
No.
of creative
This
force.
is true,
So.
and with the estate involved, yeah. So, but I mean, it's just a there is no physical portrait description anywhere, even in the scattered bits in the unfinished tales about what Anatar looks like. You can go in almost any direction. So, but yeah, I'm just it'll be something.
Yeah,
Well, and obviously he's a beautiful blonde man, so.
I'm hoping. Like, just please don't make a brown person the villain. Like,
Yes. Don't take Ismail Cruz Cordova and make him Anatar. On the one hand, it's one of those things, it's punishing. On the one hand, man, he'd be a perfect Anatar.
He
On the other hand,
would.
It's like,
Yeah.
no.
That's the other thing about all these actors of color is that there were actors of color in the film trilogy, but they were all under makeup.
yep.
So it doesn't, I feel like, yeah, you're giving work to actors of color, but in a way it doesn't count as diversity and representation if you're
No.
just going to put latex all over them.
No.
Mm-hmm.
No.
So,
The one thing I can think of that maybe, and this is, this almost sort of questions how we deal with the question of colonialism type stuff, that maybe some of these actors are playing characters of representatives of other kingdoms of men, you could say, or other lands or cultures that the Numenorians are eventually starting to conquer.
Oh no.
Yeah, that's a way to push the colonial angle and maybe a bit too much. On the other hand, that's kind of the whole point of when the Numenorians fall, they do this
Right.
stuff. So
Yeah, is it better or worse if you have, like, is it better to just have a mixture of skin tones present but the Numenorians and the men who are in Middle Earth still, so that you have, like, different kinds of people or different skin tones colonizing different skin tones, instead of having, like, either, like, you run into problems whether it's white Numenorians colonizing, darker skin toned Middle Earthians, simply because
well, that's still like the Numenorians are like the best men.
right.
And they fall when they become, horrible people, but they're still the best. So if you make them all white, that's a point about colonialism, then it's like,
You're just reinforcing, like, you're just retelling history. But it's also, I don't particularly want to see, like, have the Numenorians all be dark skinned and then have them enslave other, like, that sucks too.
Wow, there's yeah. There's a thought.
yeah,
I hadn't even thought
it's
of
a
that.
deeply white story, and it's not going to help if you.
It's right, just like, it's the skin is different. Like, it's like, are you trying to say that all people, regardless of skin tone, would I don't know. It's just
It is a mess.
We're moving into a tough area here, and I was, I won't repeat the joke, but I do think it's interesting that, Christopher Tolkien having passed around the time that this is announced. I mean, this was something he gave up direct role of the estate and the signing off the deals and any involvement, back 3 years ago. So, but I do think this is kind of the official phase where I reached the point that the estate in combination with things are like, okay, what is the wider world? What is the
Yes.
wider world we're living in? What is the potential audience?
Right.
And just trying to find some way to address something which, again, now reads.
right. Well, and it's also slightly different too, like reading the story as like you see the, white-skinned and dark-haired Numenorians, and they are the villains in that story very clearly. It is very clearly like, hey, this sucks and is bad, and this is why they lost, paradise. But for some reason, translating that to the screen, like you either have to make it a completely white story, but then you don't have any visual representation at all, and that feels unrealistic and kind of bad. But then when you do bring like you can't in a visual medium, you cannot divorce what's happening in this world from what you see every day. Whereas I think it's easier to do that when you're reading it. Or maybe I'm just a thoughtless reader.
No. I mean, I think we're in the midst of things like this. I mean, you want to take it out, like especially over the past 20 years, whether it's the Ron Moore Battlestar Galactica, whether it's the new Star Wars movies, these issues, especially who ultimately is telling the tales, who ultimately pulls the strings, who signs off on the paychecks. There's a lot here, and maybe this should be something for a separate episode, or maybe later on as we get more footage, more things. It's a starting point. We wish everybody well. We're very interested. We'd love to know who everyone's playing. We probably won't for a while, but hopefully next month we'll start being able to start getting actual, the equivalent of spy reports and things like that, and maybe get some senses of what's out there. So that'll be good there too. But my gosh, we've talked a lot about this. We still have a whole main topic to go.
I know, and it's similarly thorny too. Like,
oh yeah.
Oh yeah, but Oriana, it is yours, and the time is now. So lead us on into it.
Dwarves. Where'd they come from? What are they doing in the story? And are they proof that Tolkien was an anti-Semite? Uh-oh. The last one is a no from
Strap
me.
in, folks.
Yeah, strap in. Yeah, this is, oh God.
We're going big.
I mean, like I'm already going to come down and say like, no, I think that's a no, but it is something that I think we have to talk about because there's a lot of nuance here. So first, we'll wade into those waters in a second, but first, for the uninitiated, if you've only read The Hobbit or even just Lord of the Rings, where did the dwarves come from? Because it's a fascinating sort of story. Like, on a meta level, Tolkien's world has dwarves because the Nordic sagas did. That was just, that was baked in kind of. But within the text itself, they're created by one of the semi-gods, as I like to call them, the Valar, who this guy was really impatient to have conscious beings to love and to teach, and unfortunately his memory of what those beings were supposed to be like just wasn't very good, and so he's trying to create what were supposed to be elves and men, and he kind of messes it up. But and he's ready to destroy them because he knows that he has messed up and he wasn't supposed to do this. But the creator is like, no, don't destroy them. It's okay. But, they got to be asleep for a while. The elves and men have to kind of come before them. But they are a people apart. They have their own language that is very, very different from the other languages of Middle-earth, taught to them by their maker, and they don't teach it to other peoples. They don't speak it around other peoples. They're master craftsmen, and they prefer mining and smithing and masonry. They don't farm. But also, they were created to be really, really hardy and withstand a lot of physical trauma, I guess, because they were to come in an age that was dominated by, a very evil dude, Sauron's boss. And few of them, ever served the enemy of free will, is sort of a direct quote. They were very resistant to evil, unlike men.
Yeah.
I don't know. Well, okay, so what was you guys' first... Do you remember reading about the dwarves at first? What was your first impression of these guys?
Well, speaking for me, sort of going back to my Tolkien origin story, that would have been the Rankin Bass Hobbit. So basically that visual cue, and that again, very much the blend of the Rankin Bass and the Japanese animators' top craft sort of interpreting the characters. I don't want to say that fully impinged on my memory, but it was kind of like hard to overcome for a while. It's sort of like other interpretations had to come out, almost had to see other paintings, other works, even the Hildebrand brothers, just to give myself something different from the Rankin Bass versions. Because while Tolkien had some illustrations of dwarves that he sort of scribbled out, they were not the formally published ones that came with the book. So you don't really have a sense of what a dwarf even really looks like, and all that, beyond of course the vivid descriptions in the book itself. And then you pick up on the colors of the hoods and things like this. My impressions of them as characters, that's very good. I mean, with The Hobbit, of course, as the logical starting point. I'll just simply say, because otherwise I'll just go on this forever, that the ones who stand out are, and I think this says something, is that you have Thorin, because he's Thorin. You have Balin, because you get the sense of him as the second in command, you could say, but also the one who connects the most with Bilbo, which I think is very important. Sort of the one who sort of like just even in the small moments, and then. Frankly, Bombor, because he's fat. Yeah. and that's kind of blunt, but it is a running series of frickin' fat jokes.
Well, and and like there were as in The Hobbit, they're far more of a collective. Very few of them get distinct character traits because, there's 12 of them,
13.
13, yes, because Gandalf is 15. I forget. So there's 13 of these little guys. That's too much characterization to have to deal with. So they often, speak as one, act as one, and the only ones we truly get any real characterization of are like Thorin, Bombur, and Balin. Fili and Kili, they're the young ones. But that's pretty much it.
They're the fun ones.
Yeah.
And then in the films, they were the hot ones. But let's set aside
that for now.
Set aside that for now.
Hot dwarves.
I found that personally upsetting.
Was it because you were attracted to them, though?
No. It was like, why are you casting hot dwarves?
Yeah.
It was weird. It was like kind of Uncanny Valley.
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes.
They're not supposed to be hot. They're just like weird stone people.
Well, right, especially because they had, in The Lord of the Rings, we had already established the dwarves as, beardy and, John
Rhys Davies,
yeah, that's it. That's all she wrote. And then we've got hot ass.
Got BBC miniseries dwarves.
Yeah,
yeah, pretty much. They talk about let's not completely derail into talking about those films, but briefly, I will say they very much talked about that when they were adapting a story. The question that we've been talking about, how do you individuate them? How do you do that? And they ended up coming with all kinds of crazy backstories for everybody, just to give the actors something to hold on to in the portrayals.
Cut all the footage of them.
Yeah. So, but a separate thing. But Jared, what was your first thought of the dwarves? Pulling on Oriana's question there.
Well, so I mean, my first exposure to Tolkien at all was The Hobbit, and they're just like sort of comic bumblers.
Yeah,
that's their whole thing. How did you guys have a civilization? You can't even walk through the wilderness. But when you're a kid, that's funny and everything. I never really cared about them an awful lot until I read the appendices of Return of the King and was like, there's that brief section about dwarves, and it goes into all these weird details about dwarf women looking a lot like dwarf men.
Right? Does that mean that they have beards too?
I think we're supposed to assume that.
They did that in the movies.
Yeah.
They gave them light beards, yeah.
And then reading the Silmarillion, and there's that section about the creation of dwarfs, and I was like, oh my god, they're so cool.
It's so cool.
I dug out, I've got, various of the books here to pull from. Let me see, I forgot to properly get this earlier, but sort of going back to a story that we had already touched on. Let's see if we've got this right here. Here we go. So this was the story. This is the original version of the story of the death of Thingol, essentially, because it was at the hands of the dwarves. And now there's much more detail here than anywhere in terms of later versions of the story about like elves and dwarves and how they interact. And again, we're talking about Tolkien as a very young man, a very young writer. This is literally 1917, 1918 period when he's writing all this. So, don't think of this as sort of the way forward. This is him drawing on very clearly those Nordic influences that Oriana was talking about. But just to read a section from it, a couple of things, both in dialogue and description. Let's see now. So talking about the dwarf city Nogrod will be talked about here, where the dwarves originally were. Howbeit in crafts and sciences and in the knowledge of the virtues of all things that are in the earth or under the water, none excel them. Yet they dwell beneath the ground in caves and tunneled towns, and aforetime Nogrod was the mightiest of these. Old are they, and never comes a child among them, nor do they laugh. They are squat in stature, and yet are strong, and their beards reach even to their toes. But the beards of the Indrafangs are the longest of all, and are forked, and they bind them about their middles when they walk about. All these creatures have men called dwarves, and say that their crafts and cunning surpass those of the gnomes. Gnomes, again in this context, are elves. Gnomes in marvelous contrivance. But of a truth there is little beauty in their works of themselves, for in those things of loveliness that they have wrought in ages past, such renegade gnomes as was Ufedin have ever had a hand, etc., etc. And then it just sort of talks about other stuff here. So again, you're getting a sense of where it differs from later, later conceptions of what dwarves are like. And he's specifically casting them as kind of like, weird alien, no kids. Strange creations, the details about like wearing their beards around their middle, which is a lovely random detail. But you get a sense that he's just sort of like, I've got a trope. Blah,
Yeah.
and he puts it out there, and it's a matter of how he refined the trope from there on in, as you were saying, Oriana.
Yeah, that's so here's where we start to get into slightly deeper waters, let's call it. Because, as we have talked about several times, Tolkien detested allegory, but he did discuss the influence of Semitic languages on the Dwarven tongue a few times. And in one interview in 1967, I believe, he said that he did think of the dwarves and Jewish people as having certain similarities, particularly the dwarves of the Lonely Mountain being driven from their homes and dispossessed, keeping their language private tongue and adopting the language of their adoptive environments. So he did see similarities there. And, as a person who creates story things, I work with words. Myself, I can see cherry picking inspirational elements. If I'm creating a character who's like a cis male in his mid-20s, I'm going to mix and match traits from different men in their mid-20s that I know, at least to start with. So you can see that. But then there's this sort of unfortunate dwarvish obsession with treasure. Like, not all dwarves have this particular obsession with treasure. Like, we're introduced to it in The Hobbit. And here, I read a paper by Rebecca Brackman. It's like 10 years old. But it's Dwarves Are Not Heroes, Anti-Semitism and the Dwarves in J.R.R. Tolkien's writing. And we'll link to that in the show notes because it's very interesting. It's kind of a crazy roller coaster. But not all dwarves are like the dwarves in The Hobbit. The driving force is more creative than accretive, let's say. They make things, and some of them do fall what's described in The Hobbit as quote unquote dragon sickness. But even in The Hobbit, which is like the most quote unquote problematic of the texts when it comes to dwarves and anti-Semitic tropes, dwarves aren't the only ones who fall to this dragon sickness. Like, Thranduil is just as drawn to the treasure of the Lonely Mountain as anyone else. The master of Lake Town is similarly comes to a bad end. He's a bad egg to begin with, but he takes the treasure and his portion of the treasure and absconds with it, essentially. And it's strongly implied throughout that this hoard in particular has a sort of spell over it because of the dragon who possessed it. But at the same time, like, even in the Silmarillion, we do see that, like, as we just discussed, like the dwarves of it was the dwarves of Nogrod that killed Thingol, right?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's essentially over like payment for a necklace, but also like
The original uncut gems.
right. Oh my god. I actually was thinking about that very, very thing because, like, I was like, oh my god, it's Thorin and the Arkenstone. Adam Sandler and the Black Opal in Uncut Gems.
Sandler as Thorin. I may have to lie down.
I'm just saying. We'll talk more about, like, the specific problem with the dwarves, but Tolkien seems to have this running theme of, like, materialism and binding yourself to physical, gold and jewels is bad. Like Feanor, the master, the greatest craftsman in the Legendarium, essentially, he messes up the entire world because of a greedy love and over attachment to these objects that he made. And he's an elf, But there is this one passage in The Hobbit that is unfortunate, let's say, and I will read it. It says, "There it is. Dwarves are no heroes, but calculating folk with a great idea of the value of money. Some are tricky and treacherous and pretty bad lots. Some are not, but are decent enough people like Thorin and company if you don't expect too much." So
Crazy.
but at the same time, when I actually did not recognize any anti-Semitic tropes, or I did not connect any of this with anti-Semitic tropes until literally just now. Like, just as I was, like, doing research for this episode, and looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, kind of. As a child, certainly not. I don't know. Did you? Yeah. What was?
I did not draw that connection at all. I forget where I first saw it spelled out. I believe it was some criticism I read 90s maybe or something like that, somewhere along the way, when I started to pick up on reading more criticism beyond appreciative scholarly criticism. In other words, more combative criticism, you could say,
Yeah.
for lack of a better term, when you're moving beyond the fanboy phase,
Right.
Yeah.
and you're sort of just reading things. And I believe it was picked up along those lines, sort of drawing that out a bit. Now I can't remember if it was like a full essay or anything like that. It was one of those things you're sort of going, and you have to think about it a bit. But I mean, it's hard. It is really hard because it's so disconnected. You feel, especially, the later we get from the time period, it's not. I mean, we live in a horrible era where certain stereotypes are flourishing once again.
Right.
Let's take that as read. But in a, I don't want to say a better time back in the mid 70s, I don't think that was accurate. I think just in a different time, I did not pick up on that at all. That'd be the best way to put it.
Well, if you're not conscious of something, then you're not going to know that it's a stereotype. Like, I didn't even know when I was, I'm so ashamed to admit this in a way, up until I was, I don't know, 20 or something, I didn't really know what an anti-Semitic trope looked like.
Right.
So
Right.
I wasn't able to pick up on it. And I think that's part of how the books are able to kind of slide under the radar in some ways, is that they aren't like full on, they're not quite there. And it's so complicated because the narrative voice is like, dwarves are like this. But then the actual way the dwarves behave is always at odds with what the author is saying they're doing. He may have had certain ideas in his mind about how they are, calling them no heroes or whatever, but there are moments where they are heroic. Like, Bilbo maybe doesn't expect too much of them. It's supposed to be Bilbo's voice that we're reading it through, but it makes it harder to recognize the tropes when the book itself is insisting one thing and the characters are insisting another. Like, if the dwarves did actually suck as people the way the book kind of wants them to,
Right.
then I think as a kid, I'd be like, wow, this is really uncomfortable. Maybe I would have noticed it earlier.
Although I don't even know, like, if we look at the goblins of J.K. Rowling's Wizarding World, the Harry Potter series, that to me, as a child, I didn't realize, even though, like, I went to school with like a ton, I think that was what it was. I went to school with like a ton of Jewish kids. And so obviously I never would have connected these like a horrible like there's just
Yeah.
it's just not going to work. But in Rowling's world, they literally control the banks and deal in money and have long hooked noses and that sort of thing. So that to me reads as like, I don't know if she, was just borrowing from, I don't know what's going on
Like if
there.
you're borrowing from banker stereotypes, you think that's what you're doing, but banker stereotypes originate somewhere.
Right. So
Yes.
that's a whole thing. Whereas the dwarves, like in The Hobbit, I think one of them, when they're all wrapped up by the spiders, like one of them has a long nose and can breathe easier, but the rest of them don't. There isn't the physical sort of thing. It's just that they have this language that is based on Hebrew. But you don't get that in The Hobbit. Like they don't really speak Dwarvish in any way.
I don't think there's even any indication in The Hobbit that they speak a different language.
Right. Yeah, that comes later. So it's definitely, there isn't, like, it's just the treasure thing and the dispossession. That's kind of it that's there. And, him coming out and saying like, oh yeah, I did kind of think about the Jewish people. But he did seem to recognize that was like during World War II and afterwards, like he was like, oh, I might have done a bad, how can I fix this? And so then you get Gimli in The Lord of the Rings, who is very consciously heroic and cool and, he's flawed in his own way. But, and even when a German publisher wrote to Tolkien, wanted to make a translation of The Hobbit, this was, during the bad times. And they
1938, I think.
Yeah, they asked him essentially about his blood status, and he drafted a letter to them saying that he regrettably didn't think he had any ancestry of that, quote, gifted people. So he, seems to have been like, oh yeah, no, I'm not. But I don't think he was anti-Semitic, but there is still, he's doing that thing where you can't, labeling an entire people as gifted, like it's
benevolent anti-Semitism.
Yeah, it's still race thinking, right? It's separating one particular ethnic group based on a set of characteristics that the general public may or may not think of heritable as heritable traits, but it's so easy for that to turn into anti-Semitic thinking by virtue of making that separation, of making that label, which is the same reason that Bret Stephens, oh my God, his column in the New York Times being like, oh, Jewish people are really smart. And it's like, oh God, oh no.
Yeah. You see a lot of Christians in America, especially, pull this kind of crap all the time, where they're like, oh, they're God's chosen people. They're all that. They're so amazing. We're definitely going to celebrate Passover without them.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to keep them in a bubble.
Yeah.
We don't have to worry about them because they're so chosen and special.
Mm-hmm.
Meanwhile, we're the real people.
Mm-hmm.
We're real.
Yeah.
They're fictional. And he kind of is doing the same thing all the time, where he's like, dwarves are always this. They may be really good craftsmen, but they're also kind of conveniently never around, where you can have to deal with them as people.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of feelings about that.
And
which are not
now's the time,
to this
man.
part. No, it's more about the complicated relationship of Christianity and Judaism. It's not really relevant to dwarves. It's a whole other.
That is a whole thing.
Whole other thing.
That is a whole thing.
Well, I was thinking just now that I think part of the reason, let me rephrase this. It'd be interesting to see how a generation after both yours and mine regards the dwarves now, thanks to the impact of the films.
Right.
Thinking of, because if you see the films, you think of the dwarves as essentially Scottish.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're like
Yes.
little warriors.
Yeah.
Yeah. And obviously it's much more varied and different with the various characters of the Hobbit in those films. But yeah, but setting that aside, if you basically see the movies, you're not delving further. Your impression is you don't get any of this.
No.
It has been sort of erased.
Yeah.
For better or for worse. But again, as you said, the Gimli is self-consciously, dare I say, portrayed not as the same way as the dwarves in The Hobbit. He's a very particular dwarf. I mean, again, you could say the closest elements. The closest elements could almost be sort of that we do have Glowin briefly in the Lord of the Rings, because he's there in Rivendell.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and he's there, and those senses against of dispossession, I forget which things you're responding to, but it's more bad news for the dwarves. That comes up in the council, and Glowin takes a moment to pause and say, "Alas, when will come the day of our revenge?"
Mm-hmm.
And it's the little touch of that, but nowhere near as deep. And yeah, you do get more out of Glowin in Lord of the Rings than you ever do in The Hobbit, which I think is interesting.
Very true.
Well, Gimli is, I don't know, I really appreciate Gimli, just, on every level.
Yeah.
But also, he gets to, possibly very self-consciously on Tolkien's part, refute a lot of the dwarf stereotypes. Like, you never see him make anything. He's just there to kill people. But he gets to, they go to the glittering caves, and Legolas is like, "Oh, you people would ruin it." And Gimli's like, "No, these are beautiful caves. We would not do anything to them except enhance their beauty, but they're already beautiful. We wouldn't do anything."
Yeah.
And he gets to have this really long, beautiful speech. He gets to be like Galadriel's, courtly knight thing. He gets to be so much beyond what else is said about dwarves.
Yeah.
Which is cool.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, thank you for just the reminder of that. I mean, it's just sort of like, Gimli as a character is so multi-leveled. I mean, the especially since he translated into the film, we do get the him and Galadriel, that the connection, and how that is elaborated in very striking ways in the book. But yeah, the whole section of him recalling what the glittering caves are like, I mean, that's poetry. It's the soul of an artist. He's speaking in terms of living sculpture. It's a very striking scene, and it's the type of thing that, because it's such an individual thing, it sort of allows the possibility, what are other dwarves individually like, and all that, much more through that angle.
And I kind of hope that we get to see more of that in the Amazon series, because we are going to have the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, or theoretically we will.
I really hope so. I would love to see a functioning Moria.
Oh my god, I would love that.
That would be nice. That would be really nice. And there is at least one dwarvish character we know of, because it's carved in the runes on the door. It's Celebrimbor, but with a character called Narvi, I believe, a dwarf called that name. So there's something. So something that occurred to me earlier was digging out, and this is sort of maybe contrasting, Gimli having developed what Tolkien did with Thorin later, meaning after the publication of Lord of the Rings, because there's some of it in the appendices, but there's more of it in both Unfinished Tales and in the rapidly abandoned revision of The Hobbit that he did in the early 60s. And in digging them up just now...
Wait, revision? I don't know about this.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, well,
do go on.
Yeah.
There's a reason I have all these books. So what I'll read from first here this is a little extended. I promise not to go on forever. So first off, this is from the Unfinished Tales. This is the section called The Quest of Erebor. Some of this was redacted or placed into the appendices along with other stuff about the ring, if I remember right. But this particular conversation was not. And the setting is, this is Gandalf and Thorin talking the very night that they all arrive at Bag End, and they have the unexpected party, they have everything like that, and basically what happens is sort of like Bilbo's done his reaction. They said, "We're going to go off in the morning," and everyone goes to bed, and Bilbo's like, "Ugh," and all that sort of thing.
Bye.
So yeah, what's going on? So it's Gandalf and Thorin talking. And so this is Gandalf telling, the context is Gandalf is telling the story to everyone after Sauron's been conquered, and they're all still hanging around Minas Tirith. So this is the context. Thorin was contemptuous and suspicious. He is soft, he snorted, soft as the mud of his shire, and silly. His mother died too soon. You are playing some crooked game of your own, Master Gandalf. I am sure you have other purposes than helping me. You are quite right, I said. If I had no other purposes, I should not be helping you at all. Classic Gandalf.
I love him.
Great as your affairs may seem to you, they are only a small strand in the great web. I am concerned with many strands, but that should make my advice more weighty, not less. I spoke at last with great heat. Listen to me, Thorin Oakenshield, I said. If this hobbit goes with you, you will succeed. If not, you will fail. A foresight is on me, and I am warning you. I know your fame, Thorin answered. I hope it is merited. But this foolish business of your hobbit makes me wonder whether it is foresight that is on you, and you are not crazed rather than foreseeing. So many cares may have disordered your wits. They have certainly been enough to do so, I said, and among them I find most exasperating a proud dwarf who seeks advice from me, without claim on me that I know of, and then rewards me with insolence. Go your own ways, Thorin Oakenshield, if you will, but if you flout my advice, you will walk to disaster, and you will get neither counsel nor aid from me again until the shadow falls on you. And curb your pride and your greed, or you will fall at the end of whatever path you take, though your hands be full of gold. He blenched a little at that, but his eyes smoldered. Do not threaten me, he said. I will use my own judgment in this matter, as in all that concerns me. Do so, then, I said. I can say no more. Unless it is this. I do not give my love or trust lightly, Thorin, but I am fond of this hobbit and wish him well. Treat him well, and you shall have my friendship to the end of your days. I said that without hope of persuading him, but I could have said nothing better. Dwarves understand devotion to friends and gratitude to those who help them. Very well, Thorin said, after a silence. He shall set out with my company, if he dares, which I doubt. But if you insist on burdening me with him, you must come too, and look after your darling. Interesting choice of words. And there's a lot to unpack there, but before we go into that further, here is the other thing. Now, the sequel that I mentioned, which apparently just accidentally blew Jared's mind about. So I shouldn't say sequel, I'm sorry, revision. So this was a final revision of The Hobbit that Tolkien considered, that he didn't complete. He did do, after he wrote Lord of the Rings, he did, of course, do revisions on various versions of The Hobbit, updates to sort of put everything into sync, especially, of course, the Gollum chapter. But in the early 60s, to explain the context here, he basically addressed the tonal difference between Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. Two stories set in the same universe that have radically different tones. One is a very much a chatty kid's tale with a very sort of active narrative voice. The other one is, of course, Lord of the Rings, and it's, much more different sort of ways to do things. So he basically posited the idea of rewriting The Hobbit more in line with Lord of the Rings. Not entirely, but to play out the fiction. Remember, the whole idea is that The Hobbit is supposed to be ultimately drawing on Bilbo's own memories of things. This is meant to step outside of Bilbo's own memories of things and look at everything from a slightly more removed angle. Yeah. There are other details and bits in here, however, about the story, and here's something that sort of comes up. So this is the discussion. Originally in The Hobbit, as we know it, this is where Gandalf is explaining how he got the map. And also, if I remember right, the map, exactly.
Well,
and
the map
I think
and the
there's
key, yeah.
The map and the key, yeah. Both of them. That's what I was trying to say. So anyway, here's what's going on. And this gives you an idea of sort of the reactions and other elements. And unfortunately, I think kind of circles back to things that in that passage that I both read and that Oriana's been talking about. And so this is Gandalf to Thorin. And Thrain, your father, went away on the 21st of April, 100 years ago last Thursday. I always love that detail.
Really, yeah.
And has never been seen by you since. Too true, alas, said Thorin. Well, your father gave me this map 91 years ago, and I have guarded it ever since. 91 years, cried Thorin. For 91 years you have kept my property? Thorin, said Gandalf quietly, though your fame had reached me, I first met you only a few weeks ago. Until then, the use and meaning of this map was quite unknown to me, and I did not know who it belonged to. If I have chosen my own time for restoring it, you have no right to be angry. I came by it only at the peril of my life, for which I think you owe me some thanks. I give it to you now, he said, handing the map to Thorin with a bow. I thank you, said Thorin. I would thank you more, maybe, if your words were not dark. I do not understand them at all. And John Rateliff, who edited the History of the Hobbit, the books that I'm drawing from specifically there, notes that the brusqueness, the harshness of Thorin in this case, and the fact that he's very concerned about his property.
Mm-hmm.
Now tie that in with the Unfinished Tales passage I read, and you have an interesting portrait of Thorin outside of the Hobbit, I guess is the best way to put it. Somebody who's sort of like, you get a sense of sort of where he's coming from. He's a little more dark. He's overall, this is much more sort of like, I don't want to say more, adult Thorin is not the word, because he's always a bit of a very proud character and all the rest of it, but he's clearly just a little more and there's more examples I could draw on, but that would just take forever. But it's interesting to consider after what Gimli had been done and portrayed in Lord of the Rings, how he's going back and sort of trying, okay, how can I characterize Thorin and make him more individual? And that's the kind of path he takes. And it's something to chew over. So
yeah, very much more. Like in this, I see more of the the heir to a kingdom, rather than someone who feels entitled to all of his property, not because of some kind of character, some sort of trope drawn from the wider world, but because that's how heirs to thrones are. He has been he saw his kingdom taken away from him by this worm. He saw the Lonely Mountain. He saw Erebor at its height, and he saw it destroyed, and so it makes sense that he, as a character, as an individual, would feel entitled to certain things, to being treated in a certain way, to being spoken to in a certain way, to being given a map in a certain, in a timely fashion. How could you not have looked harder for me?
Agreed.
That's what's so annoying about it, is that it makes sense for him as a character, but if we didn't have the other stuff,
right,
it would be fine. But we do have the other stuff.
We do.
It's so thorny.
Yeah.
And
I think ultimately, this is maybe, I'll throw in, I think my last point is, it's just a common thing. You always wish you had more. It'd be interesting to see what Tolkien could have done to spend more time on it. But again, there's only so much time. There's only so much interest. We've got what we've got.
Right.
And we've only got so much. That's really what it comes down to. We have to work with what's there, and it's not much.
Yeah. And that is one thing. Dwarvish as a language is very underdone. He didn't, he just didn't do as much work on it. And I think that is why, that may be why some of these tropes, particularly in The Hobbit, were there, and the Silmarillion too. I think that perhaps if he had continued refining, maybe less of that would have made it into the final product. But Ned, as you said, time. He just didn't. He was concentrating on other parts of the story, other parts of the world, and the dwarves are a little underbaked, maybe.
Time to sort of wrap up, and that means moving on to the choice of topic for the next episode, and that choice is Jared's. Please take it away.
So, as I have threatened, I want to talk about fan art.
Woo!
All right.
Not just fan art, but I guess maybe a better term would be fan work. So
yes.
Fan fiction, fan art. I think it's really interesting. I am, as many listeners probably know, a fan artist myself. Yeah, I just think it's a really cool topic. I will say, I'm considering this distinct from fandom as a whole. This is just creative work produced by fans. So, yeah.
Sub-creation of
sub-creation.
Yeah.
Hey, there's a way to talk about it. That sounds great. No, that's fascinating. Yeah, there's a lot out there, and so many random side stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's a work. Sorry, I had to blow something off my little painting here. It's a work that lends itself to fan interpretation because,
yes,
I mean, we could talk more about this in the episode, but description is relatively sparse. There's so many there's so much texture to it that you can just kind of snag on.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be fun.
That'll be great. All right. Well, that'll be next month indeed, and we are looking forward to that. Well, hopefully we'll maybe have some first reports, pictures, something to talk about.
Yeah.
Even though there'll only be fan photos from or spy photos or something like that from the series once it comes in. So we'll obviously be tracking that. Things are starting to ramp up. It will be good, and we have a wonderful subject to talk about. And really, artistic interpretation fan art. I'm not saying that's what John Howe does, but to a degree.
Well, yeah.
It's
Anything.
kind of fan art.
In the artistic interpretation of Middle Earth, that sort of counts with that. It's just at a very high, elegant end, so it all ties in. So thank you for listening as always. We are very happy because the time worked, and my neighbors have not started what is bound to be their noisy party yet. So I am grateful. So that means we got all this through. So thank you all again very much for listening. As always, please check out our Patreon through Megaphonic FM if you'd like to support the show. Further details, as always, at the end. Full show notes on our main page for the episode. We'll have a lot to link. Until next month, we'll see you then. Thanks very much. Thanks again for listening to this episode of By-The-Bywater. Please subscribe and rate us via your favorite podcast listening options.
Episodes and show notes are at megaphonic.fm/bythebywater, all one word. You can also message us through here. Email us at bythebywater@megaphonic.fm or follow us on Twitter at By-The-Bywater.
You can also follow us individually on Twitter and ask questions there. I'm at Vandroid Helsing.
I'm at Schwinter, SCHWINDTER.
And I'm Ned Raggett, 2 G's, 2 T's. By-The-Bywater is a proud member of Megaphonic Podcast Network. Find all our fancy little shows at megaphonic.fm. We hope you join us again next time. Until then, Namarie.